Okay, welcome to the SumerSports show. We're going to do a Friday edition this week, in part because we're having some programming changes on the station. We already have the class podcast with Sam Brookhouse, which Ben Brown, who's with me today, data scientist extraordinaire at SumerSports, and Tej Seth. We also have Stats and Schemes with Tej, as well as Sean Syed, and which we're going to announce right now, the SumerSports 2024 draft show is going to be debuting tonight on Channel 88, Sirius XM NFL. Myself and Thomas Dimitrov, the two normal hosts of this show, will be on tonight. We've actually already taped it. It's a great show already. We're talking about wide receivers on that. Please tune in. But for now, we're going to use this space sometimes Fridays, sometimes Thursdays, sometimes Mondays. I'm going to talk here with my good friend, former colleague at PFF, now colleague at SumerSports, Ben Brown. Ben, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Okay, that was a very good intro. I would say, kind of like you said, exciting news about Sirius. Obviously, your ability to kind of coordinate and set that up. I think kind of was the groundwork was laid on Radio Row at the Super Bowl in Las Vegas. I think it leads to a question that I have to pitch back to you, which was you've kind of been on this, I would say, MJ type run from a trip perspective with like the whole football analytics community. I think you've got a number of different options, and I want to know, just from like my perspective, how would you kind of rank the order of events that you were able to kind of attend for the past 2 months in this like crazy NFL cycle?
Yeah, so Ben's referring to the gray hairs that I inevitably have in my beard, on the top of my head, the hair that's left. Yeah, it's been crazy. Like I promised Tej Seth, our colleague, one of our best friends, that if the Lions ever hosted a playoff game, I would take him. So that was like the first trip I took, divisional round, or no, wild card round.
Rams Lions, basically, in Detroit, the illustrious city.
I went with him and Arjun Menon, one of our interns when we were at PFF, a phenomenal football mind. So we went there. By the way, I'll rank that. That's the second best football event I've ever been to, behind the Super Bowl in Miami between the Chiefs and the 49ers. And the
first
49ers.
edition. Yeah,
so we'll throw that one out. I also went to Ravens versus Texans. Look, I break streaks. That was the first time the Ravens had won a home playoff game in over a decade. That was a lot of fun. I got to meet some really cool people, including, I went with Corey Krawick, who's now the director of player personnel, with the director of player personnel strategy with the Los Angeles Chargers. He was manager of football analytics there. Got to meet Mike McDonald, who he was living with at the time, who's now the head coach of the Seahawks. That was a lot of fun. But after that, it was our Tulane sports analytics or contract negotiation competition. Yeah, with Super Bowl, Combine, and Sloan. And so that was a heck of a run. I slept in a lot of hotel beds. And if I had to rank them as events, NFL events, I would have to rank them, Ben, as I would still go Combine as the first football event. If I had to rank the most fun, I think the NFL Scouting Combine is the best event. Second most fun event is the Super Bowl, and most specifically Radio Row. Going to the Super Bowl is it's obviously great, and it's a spectacle. It's just another football game after a certain amount of time. So
no correlation with the top top NFL event you've ever been to also being a Super Bowl. It just worked out that way, more so than the illustriousness of the game, is what you're saying, right?
By the way, Sean Donahue, a friend of the show, pumped to talk Jake Reed while two Minnesota kids talking football on a Friday. So I would say that so just watching my favorite team, as a fan, the Chiefs win the Super Bowl was that was the pinnacle. But if I had to just go to a random Super Bowl between like the Bengals and the Rams, like I don't think I'd enjoy it.
Wouldn't move.
But Rams Lions, it was a lot of fun just to see like that whole fan base. And I even went to Bengals Raiders 3-4 years ago when the Bengals won their first playoff game in God knows how long, and that was also a lot of fun. just to see a fan base exhale. Now, the Bengals post that have been really interesting as a fan base, but that was fun to see them at least get that one. And then I will say the Tulane contract negotiation competition is the third most fun, and it's closer to the Super Bowl than you'd think. It's a lot of fun to see, that judge for that competition, see people in the league. It's a different set of sort of slice of people. It's mostly like admin folks, people who actually negotiate contracts in the league, and they're some of the smartest people in the NFL. And then after that, I would say Sloan is last. And not to say that like I actually have a lot of fun, talking to people from other sports. I have really a lot of fun in the mentorship program, meeting a student every single year and helping them with some of their trials and tribulations through are the industry that we love. But for me, Sloan is a little bit more on the kind of thought leadership portion now, and and to puff up a few people now. You go to like SEAMSAC, which is run by Ron Yurko and the folks at Carnegie Mellon. You go to Nessus, which is run in the Northeast, and like also Cascada, the conference in the Pacific Northwest by the Canadians. Like all those conferences are actually like pretty solid and hold up relative to Sloan in the sports analytics space.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with you, and I do think I got to participate in the last two with you. Top notch, I would say programs, and it was cool to be around a lot of like individuals, especially at like the college or like master's or grad school type level, really trying to like enter into either like the contract space or the NFL or just sports at large analytics space. So I had a ton of fun as well. I have to go back to it because I did catch the fact that because Corey got hired for the Chargers, you did refer to them as Los Angeles and not San Diego, even though they haven't won the AFC West yet. So I'm wondering, are you updating your priors on our Los Angeles Chargers now with their latest offseason additions?
Good question. Yeah, so I think so. I mean, and no disrespect to anybody who is there, and I hope people know that. And it's different now that I'm at Sumer. I actually did the last PFF forecast. The podcast that I did with George. I did the last one after leaving. I did that podcast for 4 years. That was a far more entertaining show, I would say, than this one, where Thomas and I are really trying to educate. I have an entertainment like bone to me. And so obviously I joke about the Oakland Raiders and the San Diego Chargers because neither one of those teams has won a division since they've moved. And I'm joking, of course, but
right.
Yeah, of course I'm bullish on the Los Angeles Chargers. I think that the Ravens have for a long time had a glut of talent. David McDonald's, who currently the director of analytics there. Derek Yam is one of their data scientists who's a phenomenal guy, was at StatsBomb before and is currently there. And obviously Corey has done tremendous work. There's a lot of people see me as kind of like an entity in and of himself, but like I'm interacting with a lot of people throughout the league who are either telling me, "Hey, Eric, like this is really stupid what you just said," or "Hey, you're on the right path here." Like, and it's a pretty good. There are tons of people in the league who don't have the platform that I have, who are incredibly bright and who are doing great work in the league, and Corey's one of them, and I think that the Chargers got I think I'm really thrilled that they were progressive enough to put him in that seat. And I think Joe, from everything that I've learned about the Ravens, like they're a very good organization from top down. And so it was actually pretty remarkable for me to sort of see that team and all the great things that they were doing and how few of them were getting chances. And then all the floodgates opened this year. And so many of them had gotten their opportunities after that. And so it made sense. I think the next question is like the Kansas City Chiefs are another one where, Mike Borgonzi, the assistant GM, hasn't gotten his chance. Brant Tillis finally got his chance in Carolina, but he's second in command now to Dan Morgan-ish. I think actually he's more like 1B. And there are a lot of these teams where there are very smart people working at these teams. And the more that I can see these really smart people sort of making their way through other parts of the league, it's easier to cheer for the teams because it's fun to root for really smart people who have kind of sharpened your iron over the course of your time, my time studying the league. And obviously that's led to us building the things that we built at Sumer and prior at PFF.
Yeah, I think it is, obviously a really interesting conversation, one that we've, in some ways had behind the scenes, maybe more or less so. But I think, like, especially this time of year, obviously the talk is very much from a fan perspective. Like, we're moving on to the draft. We've had the combine, but there has been this interesting hiring cycle. And I think outside of like head coach impact and maybe GM impact, we're still trying to understand, I would say, some of these auxiliary movement pieces where guys that work in an organization that have had a ton of success. And I think it's easier, obviously to see the head coaching movement, but when you start to see the offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator movement from like the Eagles last year and just some of the struggles that they have, like, do you think there's anything from like an analytics perspective where you do see some of these marquee names that are, at roles maybe just slightly less from a GM perspective that can have, a profound impact one way or another on certain organizations? And do you think that's something that can like play into, the overall team strength that we're projecting for these teams coming up next season?
Yeah, I tend to believe that we put entirely too much, not entirely too much, but I think we put a lot of blame or
assignment.
Yeah, like we put too much credit to the people at the very top. And I think in some cases it's warranted. Like I think in Bill Belichick's case in New England and the coaching staff side, you saw obviously our boss Thomas Dimitroff, he forged his own career, and I think in a lot of ways because he was different than Bill and some of the people that came through, he was able to have success. Mike Vrabel similarly, but also his time in New England was short. I think a lot of times Bill crafted those people's careers to be the best version of the people that could help him specifically. And that doesn't make him a bad person. In fact, it made obviously them a very good franchise. I think those people, though, deserve a great deal of credit for Belichick's success. Josh McDaniel was there for a decent amount of time. And he was there for the Super Bowls in a lot of cases. I think Romeo Crennel deserves a lot of credit for those defenses. Scott Pioli deserves a lot of credit for some of that team building. Thomas Dimitroff deserves a lot of credit for the college scouting, especially. I mean, you think about it this way, and I'm not trying to just talk up our boss and one of my best friends, but like Thomas, when he left, like the Patriots haven't drafted quite as well since he left, right? And so there are remnants of Bill being the main guy, but he obviously being helped. Andy Reid, same thing, like a lot. And I know the Chiefs won the Super Bowl, but Eric Bieniemy's absence was felt a lot this year. Their lack of discipline and that kind of thing. So I think that a lot of these teams, when you look, it's further down the list than the Brett Veach, and as great as Brett Veach, it's further down the list than Andy Reid. It's further down the list. It's going to be further down the list than Joe Hortitz and Jim Harbaugh. It's going to be further down the list than Mike McDonald in Seattle and so forth. So, yeah, it's a great question. And I think that some of the modeling we're doing at Sumer and some of the work that we're doing on that end, I think will go a long way towards, really carving out a better way to understand these things. And, I know, we've gotten into the B2C space a little bit with our website, SumerSports.com. We're not explicitly, giving out betting and fantasy advice yet, but like one of the ways to continue to craft an edge in this world is to go deeper. Like everybody can model with EPA now. Most sharp bettors have player level models. Does everybody have a coach level model? Some do. Does everybody have an assistant coach level model? Probably not, right? Like, so that again is sort of where you would go if you're trying to find an advantage there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, and obviously it continues to extrapolate the more you can use those sorts of edges, like the further down you have from like a betting standpoint or whatever, right? And I do think like the ushering in of micro betting, obviously even like in-game type betting, like I think the offensive and defensive coordinators are going to have a greater impact on some of those outcomes in particular, right? Especially if it's like a more of like a one play type sample or one drive type sample, as opposed to being like a full game bet. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. Obviously, only scratching the surface, but I do think the direction in which analytics is moving, it's happening very quickly, and I think it's adamant, especially on people who want to bet, to kind of further move on from. But I would say, so okay, let's pivot a little bit, because I think you kind of brought it up, obviously with the Thomas Dimitroff discussion in New England, but draft, obviously it's the highlight topic, those sorts of things. We've done a lot of work, both from a public facing standpoint and behind the scenes to me, there is, the overarching question specifically with this draft. Like I do think the Bears are obviously going to go number one with Caleb Williams and move on from Justin Fields. And then it becomes this question of, do they get enough for some other team in order to make that selection? And where do you kind of see like this quarterback class kind of stack up with some of these teams at the top? Like, do you believe in sort of the consensus ranking that we see right now with Caleb Williams at 1, and then question mark whether it's Jaden Daniels or Drake May at 2? Like, what direction do you kind of move from that standpoint, and what do you kind of make of either one of these prospects and the most recent news that we're kind of getting, and the market kind of, I would say, moving in the direction of Jaden Daniels for various reasons?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the Daniels steam. I mean, Daniels last year had the best season of any of these quarterbacks that are going to get drafted, including Caleb Williams 2022. So you're compelled by that. Now, when we were first starting out at PFF, like, we had all the data, and yet, like, one of the most predictive things was like sitting right underneath our nose, and it took us forever to see it. And that was like pressure to sack ratio. And Daniels at about 24% is going to have one of the worst marks among any player that's ever been taken in the first round, if not the worst mark, depending upon how you scale it. Like 30, he was 30% in his first year at LSU, 20% last year. Drake May and Caleb Williams were closer to that 20%, but for their career, they're closer into the teens. So you have to worry about that if you're a team like the Patriots, because you don't have a great team. You have to be less worried about that if you're a team like Minnesota that's going to move up, because you have Brian O'Neill, you have Christian Darrisaw, you have Justin Jefferson who will be open early in the pattern. You have all those things. Traditionally, quarterbacks like Justin Fields have struggled on bad teams because they hold on the ball too long. Fields, remember, our colleague Tage Seth wrote about one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the history of college football. These are at least the PFF college era, which admittingly is small. And so he struggled because he couldn't like avoid sacks, and the offensive line was terrible. And you can't really, it's your job to take pressures and avoid sacks with them. You can't necessarily manipulate pressure rate as much. There's a philosophical question there. So I think Daniels is a prospect that I would be lower on than most. I like Drake May only for the fact that, you look at the physical traits, and they can't, you can't ignore them, especially considering May has checked the box statistically on a lot of things, especially in that penultimate year. And one thing to consider is there have been quarterbacks that have gotten better in that last year. Kyler Murray, Joe Burrow, obviously Jaden Daniels, Baker Mayfield. But a lot of these quarterbacks that have had success at the NFL level of late, Jordan Love, Josh Allen, CJ. Justin Herbert, Brock Purdy, have all like peaked earlier in college and then fallen off, and then got the NFL and have done better. I think that that's possibly what you're getting with Drake May. And I personally think if I was Chicago, I would try to trade back to 2 and get May. I think that that's a much better gamble than taking Williams at 1. But I would also not be offended at all if they just took Williams at 1.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with you. This is interesting. We are getting some conversation. You can definitely keep, I would say, the comments and those sorts of things going. We got some Kirk to, minus 225 to Atlanta on DK right now. That's the first domino to fall. I actually have gotten asked that question before. To me, it's kind of like a 2 or 3 team race for Kirk, and I'm not sure. Like, outside of him not going to Atlanta, I don't know if it changes a lot from Chicago's standpoint. I feel like that's kind of the first decision that really needs to be made as far as like if they are going to take the pick, if they are going to take Caleb Williams at 1, or if they are going to move down just a little bit and take somebody else.
But Ben, would you? I get the locker room thing, and both of us, both of us played like small college football, and like so we've played football before, and we understand like the locker room thing. But why are they such in a hurry to get rid of Fields? Like, I don't understand why you can't just draft Caleb Williams and hold on to Fields. Like,
I think it's twofold. I do think the roster thing is definitely overvalued from a standpoint that it would be a risk. I do think the association of that being a risk, obviously plays a pretty big influence in the overall decision. And I think that's why. But I also think there's this idea, and again, I think this is like a risk tolerance thing, but I think teams have this idea, and we see it in some ways like discounted future draft picks where, one of those two guys is losing value sitting on the bench in a lot of ways, right? Like if he's not playing, if Justin Fields is in the starter, but he's the backup to Caleb Williams in Chicago, like I think he has a diminishing return on what they're actually going to get in the trade from a trade perspective the longer he sits. And that might not actually be true. I do think waiting in some ways, especially if there's like an injury outside to another significant quarterback early on in the season, that his value would probably go up in that scenario. But I think there's like an overall risk appetite that leans teams to go in the other direction. But I think from a team building standpoint, outside of those considerations, like it's a slam dunk to keep Justin Fields in the locker room with Caleb Williams or with Drake May for that matter, to kind of figure out what one is the best, short and long-term solution for you at quarterback.
Yeah, Alex Hussey with the thing we're all looking for, which is I need to see Kirk in Vegas, frankly.
Kirk Chains, basically. We need to see him somewhere big time.
As an Atlanta resident for the last 10 months, I have not been, but it's still available. It's still available to all of us. The thing, yeah, like Sam Bradford was the quarterback, and the Eagles traded up for Carson Wentz and were planning on sitting him the whole year. And then the Vikings, Teddy Bridgewater, tore his knee up, and they decided to trade a first-round pick, which ended up being the 13th overall pick, for Sam Bradford. The Bears are not going to get anywhere close to that, but it's not like Sam Bradford's any worse than Fields. I mean, Sam Bradford was the number 1 overall pick, so he did have some cachet from that perspective. But I just Fields is not going for much more than the second-round pick. And this is another part. Like I did a decent amount of like Bears stuff. CHGOs are really good, and Taylor Dahl does a cool podcast, the Windy Bears Bears podcast that I did. And they all love Justin Fields. And I get it. Right. He's been the best of a terrible bunch of quarterbacks. And so, and they did not help him. I understand that, all of this stuff. But, and ZT says Bears Super Bowl 25. Look, it might happen. But my issue is you can keep him. And if he plays like Drew Brees and holds off Caleb Williams, well, we already have, there's evidence that when a guy sits, it's pretty good for him.
The love. If you've never seen him before, right? Like I think it's if you've never seen him before. But
it's not the act of sitting that helps the player. It's the act of the team being good enough for you to sit.
Right.
Right. And so if the Bears can nurture Justin Fields into a good situation, and Justin Fields can play the role of Alex Smith for a year before Caleb Williams, then absolutely. But I just don't understand why they just don't hang on to him. Imagine if they would have been in a position to trade him last year when the Jets lost Aaron Rodgers. Like that's a first-round pick you can get right there. And the Bears already have enough draft capital. They have 1, they have 9, they have a bunch of picks, and they don't need another second-round pick this year. They could go and they could get another one in the future. And that's what I think.
Yeah, the risk to me, it is moving too quickly, and then they end up with like a situation where they're gonna then overpay to move up from like 9 to 5 and draft like the wide receiver, like Marvin Harrison Jr. or something like that, right? Like they're gonna overplay their hand, getting too much draft capital. But I don't know. I do like I get the idea of Justin Fields, and everyone for the most part would say he hasn't lived up to expectation. But to me, I think of a lot of teams would be really happy to get him for only a second-round pick. And if that's really the cost, associated with it, like to me, at least from a Vikings fan perspective, I would not hate that outcome where Justin Fields is my starting quarterback. And I do think there are at least a handful of teams that a lot of fans would probably have the similar refrain for, right?
So that's interesting because, okay, let's talk about the Vikings, because that's a team near and dear to your heart and to a lesser extent mine. So the Vikings right now have a $37 million under the cap. 28, their biggest cap hit this year, Ben, by a decent margin, is the $28 million cap, $28.5 million cap hit that Kirk Cousins is going to incur by letting his contract void if they don't re-sign him, right? That's the whole, you kick the can down the road with Cousins, and that has always been kind of like the Cousins Crusaders, kind of the sleight of hand that they've had, saying Kirk has been a surplus because one of these years Kirk was going to not be on the team and cost the team $30 million to produce nothing. That $28 million, so you're going to get Fields over here for a second round pick, and Fields is going to cost, a few $1 million, $5 million, let's say. I actually don't have his number right in front of me, but let's say for that. So you're spending 33.5 on your quarterback ish and a second round pick. You have to make a 5th-year option declaration on him. And that for Fields, because of things, is going to be at 25-ish. So then I just don't see, if you're the Vikings, where like your biggest problem has been your quarterback has never been under cost control and you haven't been able to build a roster around him. If Fields does well, you're in kind of the same problem. Because do you ever see, Ben, Fields being like a $40 million quarterback on the field? Is that possible? Because I guess if you do, that changes the calculus. If you don't, then it's not worth it for basically any team to trade for him.
Right. Yeah. So he's at 5.1 this year and like 6 million basically the next year. Obviously, you have the 5th-year option after that, all things considered, basically. But yeah, I think in some ways it does make sense. But you're basically working on the assumption that if things go well, basically you're paying a ton of money at the quarterback position. But they have like no other. I mean, what realistically is like a good outcome for the Vikings? Because now there's going to be a link with Russell Wilson on a very team-friendly deal. Like, is that the best case scenario for our Minnesota Vikings? Is going $2.5 million for Russell Wilson this year? Probably.
Well, so I think the Vikings' best option. So for one, they have to pay Jefferson, right? So Jefferson's 5th-year option is $19.7 million right now. They'll probably ink a $30 million APY extension, which will probably cut that number down in year 1. Harrison Smith is probably gone. That's a little bit of money that they'll get back, about $11 million. Danielle Hunter is probably gone, but again, they owe Danielle Hunter. This is again part of the reason why, when you talk about kicking the can down the road, Hunter and Cousins are going to combine for about $42 million in dead cap hits for the Vikings, just because of all of the prorating and all the void year stuff. But if you go, trade up to 3, right, and go ahead and get Jaden Daniels or Drake May, and that player, comes in when you have Brian O'Neill, Christian Darrisaw, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and Kevin O'Connell, I think that could be successful. If you maybe don't see a huge drop-off between Jaden Daniels, Drake May, and J.J. McCarthy, then you can maybe move up to 6 with the Giants or 8 with the Falcons, who maybe are taking Kirk Cousins off of your hands. Or you could stay at 11, or you could trade back and take Michael Penix or Bo Nix. Like, I think there's a lot of options for them. And they can go in and get a Jacoby Brissett or go in and get a Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson probably doesn't want to sign that big of a deal because his dead money, Ben, for the Broncos is not like traditional like bonus dead money. It's paragraph 5. He's getting like $1 million pre-tax in a check from the Broncos every week next year. Yeah. And so every dollar that the Vikings would pay him would offset what the Broncos. So in some ways, he could want to stick it to Denver and sign a minimum contract deal with the Vikings and still get, what he would get from Denver, as well as, a pittance from the Vikings, but also help that team win and rehabilitate his standing as a bridge quarterback.
Right. And I think that very much seems to be the narrative. And I do think in a lot of ways, the Vikings are probably the best fit for Wilson to actually do that in a lot of respects as well. But yeah, let's pivot back to kind of this quarterback discussion. I think we got a question on JJ McCarthy. Do you have him anywhere close to being like that 3rd overall quarterback prospect right now? It sounded like maybe you kind of leaned in the direction of Drake May still being consensus number 2 overall or our number 2 overall. To me, it seems like the Jaden Daniels, the rise doesn't really fit with where expectation was. Like, obviously coming off the Heisman Trophy, and maybe this is just a delay in like some of the information and news and how long it takes to get into the cycle. But it does seem like that rise would have happened sooner. Now it is basically close. I think, for all things considered, DraftKings Sportsbook right now has it at -120 for Drake May, +110 for Jaden Daniels to be that number 2 overall selection. Can you make a case for maybe a JJ McCarthy coming up that high, or do you think he's very much like the 3rd or 4th quarterback in this class.
I think you want to more look towards pick number 3. If you think about McCarthy that way, and I know number 3 overall pick, McCarthy is like 15-2 on FanDuel.
Yeah, plus 6. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's
DraftKings.
one to think about. Harrison is, plus 430. It depends upon the book, right? You're actually like in a position right now where the limits are low enough where you can kind of arb out some of these with the number 2 pick. I do not believe Daniels is the player at the second pick, for a couple of reasons. I think size matters, and I think Daniels is tall, but he's thin, and we've seen a lot of like Joe Burrow being kind of a thinner quarterback and going through injuries and it not being all that great for him. Kyler Murray being a smaller quarterback going through injuries, it's not being all that great for him. I think teams want the prototypical size more now. And that's working to Drake May's advantage. I think that but again, it just takes one. And that you remember the 2021 draft, Zach Wilson was not the second quarterback on a lot of teams' boards, but he was the second quarterback on the Jets board, and that's all that mattered. So it could certainly be that kind of thing where Daniels is a second player on the Washington Commanders board, and it doesn't really matter what we think. As far as McCarthy, my problem with McCarthy is I don't like when a team doesn't depend upon its players. Like I think about like Mecole Hardman, and again, I take everything back to the Chiefs. You guys all make fun of me for it, but it happens. Like Mecole Hardman was drafted over DK Metcalf in 2019 for the Chiefs, and he ended up winning 3 Super Bowls. So who am I to say that it's a bad pick? But Mecole Hardman had all the traits. He had speed, he had athleticism, and return ability. Like he was a good player for this team, but he was not a focal point of the Georgia offense. And if I'm looking at a player at the college level and he's not the focal point of his own offense, and Donovan Edwards and Blake Corum are who the Michigan Wolverines go to when it matters most, and what they would go to if they want to win football games, that's a signal to me. And I know that he has, great ability on third down, and I know all the statistics on third and down, but you have to understand they were favored in every game they played in this year. So you are completing those third and long passes against teams you're better than. So I worry about McCarthy because I think that if he was a better quarterback, if he was as good as everybody says, the Wolverines would have leaned on him more.
Right. And it does come down to this idea too of like an understanding of pressure. Obviously there's higher leverage pressure type situations that happen. And some of those things, like we don't want to gravitate to any one single data point in an overall quarterback evaluation, but the fact that you do have a much smaller sample size of that, especially in, longer down and distance type situations, like it does make at least the quarterback evaluation much more difficult to feel confident in. And I think that's really all you're describing. So I actually definitely agree with you. So it sounds like consensus from us is Williams, Locke 1, May, Daniels, then McCarthy, then Penix, basically.
I don't even know what this means. Trevor Wistral, first time getting to tune in live, and it's Eric Eager's mathematician's debut as Eric Eager, international media figure.
Look, Pinnacle, it's a broad basically or something. Or else he's trying to call you 007, James Bond. I don't know. I'm not quite sure.
Well, tonight I'll be the national radio show host. This is our podcast, and obviously Ben and I have been kicking around the idea of hosting a show together. As Ben, you're one of my best friends, and I've wanted to host a show with you for a long time, and we're kind of kicking around this idea of just two bros talking football on this platform. But if you want to listen at channel 88 on Sirius XM, it'll be the NFL radio show with myself and Dimitrov. Dimitrov will be on this channel still. It'll be more sporadic than normal because of the demands of the other show. But Ben and I will be on this show basically weekly from here on out. So when you think about the later guys, Penix and Nix, both guys are tremendous at avoiding sacks. And when I'm not just saying avoiding sacks as in like sack percentage is low, like sacks divided by dropbacks, because that can get inflated by things like screens and all the play action. All that. I'm literally looking at like when Michael Penix is pressured, he's only sacked like 7% of the time, or 6 or 7, depending upon the window of time you're looking at. That's awesome. And when I think about those guys going onto a team that's struggled, that's going to be great because you want to be able to avoid negative plays. I think about Doug Williams back in the day, the only guy that ever took the Tampa Bay Bucks to the playoffs when they were the Tampa Bay Yucks for all those years. Below 50% completion percentage, all this stuff. But you look at the finer grained data, and he's like one of the league leaders in sack avoidance. You're like, oh, okay. Well, you're not getting those negative plays. Does that give those two a chance in the NFL more than other kind of late first, early second, possible third round picks?
I definitely do think it is the case. And I do think in a lot of ways that's part of the evaluation, because the idea being that guy is going to be in a better situation than what the draft picks happening at like the top of the draft are. And in some ways, their ability to just minimize negative plays is going to be more beneficial to that overall offense. So I do like that sort of course of, or that line of thinking. I do think in a lot of ways, like that's why Penix in a way for me is, and obviously this isn't an apt comparison, but I do think, like the idea of him being able to elevate a team in the back half of the first round also makes a ton of sense. Obviously there's like the age concerns, I would say, with both Bo Nix and Michael Penix, to the point where they're not going to be, a top 10 draft pick. And I think that expectation is nowhere near close to reality. But I think overall, like when you look at some guys that can definitely work well in the right situation, the negative play avoidance, which is really stable from college to pro, definitely I would say it has to be close to, if not the most impactful, influential characteristic that you're looking for in that sort of quarterback evaluation. I do think there are probably two different schools or areas in which you're focusing that sort of quarterback evaluation on, though.
Yeah. Alex Hussey Daniels is less than a year younger than Penix, and people don't seem to care. Yeah, that's another one where people ding Penix for injuries and all this stuff, and yet an age, and they don't talk about it with other guys. By the way, Penix, injuries are more like ACLs and stuff that are not all that predictive, right? It's more the soft tissue stuff, the Deshaun Jackson stuff that really hurts players. He doesn't really have that. I actually don't think that Penix is all that risky of a prospect in today's NFL, especially if you're willing to be kind of like a more awake front office that's willing to churn and burn on the quarterback position, which I know teams aren't really willing to do that. And know Thomas Dimitroff, our boss, really, when he's drafting a quarterback, he's doing it for keeps. I think it's just so hard to do that. I think that I think that he's much less of a risk than people want to let on. So let's move on a little bit to the draft from a gambling perspective. Now, just to air our sheets a little bit, like we're not gambling on the draft. But we are aware of the markets. We do use them in some of our models, and we do want to just kind of, and we have in the past, like, in fact, Ben and some of our biggest scores have been in these markets. And in fact, during the pandemic, it was the only thing some of us could bet on for months.
Keeping us sane. The only thing keeping us sane, just admit it, basically.
And so,
that and the Madden Sims,
exactly.
right?
I mean, if we weren't betting Madden Sims, we were in a real down and out. So a few things I want to say. For one, there are real opportunities to get down some good bets. The problem is right now, because the markets are not sharp, because the limits are pretty low in a lot of places. So for example, if you go to like somewhere like Bet Online, you go somewhere like DraftKings, the limits are not particularly high. And when you go to so yeah, you can sort of like get an arbitrage opportunity between one line and another, but you're squeaking out a buck or two, right? And as you get closer and you get offshore, go to a place like Circa, it'll certainly tighten up, but then the lines will tighten up. You're not going to be able to go to one place and get Mac Jones under 3.5 at even money, and go over 3.5 at even money somewhere else. You're just not going to get those opportunities as the limit goes up. So early on, take the market with a grain of salt because the limits are pretty low. Later on, obviously, the numbers certainly mean something, but they mean a lot less than a market sort of for a game. Can you expound on that a little bit, Ben?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, basically, the manner in which we move towards like a consensus rating takes time. Obviously, with the draft, we have a much larger window than just like a game. But I think in some ways, it's not completely applicable to like the look ahead spreads, but in a lot of ways, it is similar in the amount of line movement that you would see, right? Like obviously, our evaluation of teams. From a power ratings perspective, is dramatically different heading into the season than what it's going to be in week 8. And I think you kind of see some of those similar, line movements, and that's kind of what the overall draft market in particular is kind of working towards. But there is like this obviously overarching idea or approach where we just don't have a lot, if not all of the information to really price it all that well. So I think what we're trying to say is like there might be in some ways opportunities for arbitrage, but given the fact that there is such small amounts of money that you can bet, like there is probably a much better option of just like taking good bets early on and then potentially hedging or finding like exploitable middles later on once you do see that run in your direction based on the general market, I would say, getting sharper, because like right now especially it does seem really dull, and you'll see that in the limits, and you'll honestly also see that just in the ways in which the offerings that we're getting kind of from books. It's been relatively thin until even this week we finally got some like top 5 odds and more teams than just, or more guys than just Blake Corum as options at various teams. And I think you can start to price those out. Obviously, the difficulty is these aren't two-way markets, which is kind of what Eric was implying. The multi-way markets means that it is theoretically not sound to do the arbing when you aren't getting both sides of it, or not covering all your angles. But I do think there are definitely opportunities to see markets and spreads or pricing, I would say, move in your direction if you kind of get on some of these front running trends of things that are definitely, I would say, obvious if you're kind of keeping your hand on the radar.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the big thing is, is to respond to news or to, really document how these teams are acting in the past. And, ultimately, I think at this point, if you're just trying to predict what your favorite team is going to do, a site like Grinding the Mocks is probably going to do about as well as the betting markets, if not better right now. And to your point, because those markets are so, full of basically VIG, like for example, the team market. So and so is going to go to which teams. Add up those VIG free prices, and I think that you're going to be amazed at how much, like it's like 20-30% hold. So they're really just taking bets in a market that you're basically a huge favorite to lose in anyway. So it's not something where right now you take it as gospel. I saw something, for example, where the Chiefs are like minus 150 to take a wide receiver first. I think it was ESPN Bet. And I that's something where I wouldn't necessarily lay that price, even though it's a favorite. And it's a short favorite. It makes some sense. But B, I don't think that's anywhere close to the true price. And that's largely because of the hold that they're taking in that market. We do have a question here from Trevor, more abstract on the betting world in general. Do you have any opinion on prediction markets versus the bookmaker system, which is currently standard? I mean, that generally speaking, they're sort of one and the same. They're not like, so the way that this generally works, and neither one of us are professional bettors, but we hang in some of those circles a little bit, is that the market making books, the Circas, the Chris's, the Pinnacles, are taking, are basically making the markets through the bets that they're taking from sharps. Right. And that's how they're forming the numbers. And then basically all the recreational books are copying from them. So when you say like bookmaker, you're basically looking at the bookmakers who are copying off of the very rare market makers. And oftentimes those market makers are making the lines even off screen before they offer it to the rest of us. And that happens a lot of times in, golf and things like that with very sharp players. And oftentimes the sharps are offloading risk in what are called exchanges, and they're betting against each other at certain prices as well. And usually the exchanges are even sharper than the books. And that generally speaking is probably the answer to your question. Because you can get in exchanges, you can get prices that are different than sort of even the traditional books. So that's kind of the answer. I mean, I would just say, as somebody who's waded in these waters a ton, and as Ben would say, generally speaking, both markets are quite sharp, and they don't need to be as sharp as you are, because they're getting plus 110 every time you're betting minus 110, even in the best of circumstances.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I do see it, posed sometimes, just as far as where is the sports betting market going. To me, I think the evolution is more that the market's going to grow to the point where there probably is room for both. And I think that is in a lot of ways what your answer suggests. I do think, there is going to be a sharp crowd that caters toward the prediction aspect of things, or the exchanges, really low, prices, and being able to kind of do almost more of the quant trading aspect from a sports betting standpoint. But there are going to be recreational places going to bookmakers to bet same game parlays, to bet more of the exotic offerings that maybe you're not going to get a really robust market for, at least right away from a prediction market. I think, the long-term pipe dream is that an exchange of some sort could support essentially everything. I think that's probably an overzealous idea at this point, and I don't know if that'll necessarily live up to what a lot of people probably expect. But I think in some ways, that's all to say, there, as the market grows, we're going to have the opportunity for both, and ideally both just move towards a sharper pricing model that is, beneficial long term for all bettors.
Trevor has the really good point here, which is exchanges have always been better in theory than practice, because you have to be able to fill those orders. And for example, if I create basically, I don't want to have a hanging bid of a certain number, and then things change and somebody comes and swipes me and I'm all of a sudden I have a terrible number. To match somebody is not a trivial problem, especially for the limits that people generally speaking want there. So that's always tough. And people have had that in the DFS space as well, right? Where you post up in a one-on-one, and at least there you know the price a priori, and there's not as big, you can change your lineup at the end. So in some ways it's much different, but there have been those problems forever. And you need liquidity has always been the issue for exchanges. And hopefully we can build an ecosystem in the States where sports betting kind of grows, but at a respectable and at a responsible pace, and things will, and to the point where exchanges can thrive, because I do think that that's a good model. Ben, before we go, what is your recommendation? So I'm trying to think. We had this when I was at the forecast. I'm going to read this book this weekend. I'm going to read this book, Live and Let Die by Alan Shipnuck. It's going to be about live golf. I'm excited. I got this in the mail. I don't know when I'm going to find the time, because my daughter has volleyball, and we're doing lunch with my parents the next day. But I'm gonna read this book. Damn it! What are your recommendations for the weekend?
Yeah, I said this, and I actually bought this book and brought it to Sloan with me, and didn't read a single page either, because I was too caught up in watching videos. But it's the new book. I'm spacing. It was the one that Tej and you recommended, the sports betting one done by
The Intercept.
Yeah, The Intercept. So I'm gonna hopefully at least start, if not read that. I got another one here. Basically, obviously, everyone should have this book at this point in time too. So, but other than that, I mean, I know you missed it a little bit, but this is the epitome of Minnesota sports from a small sample perspective, or a small cluster of community-based things, because it is the Minnesota State High School Hockey Tournament. So I'm actually gonna I don't know if we'll make it there tonight, but we've definitely been watching. I have a son that plays hockey, and I'll probably just be vibing out. Kind of, this is the last real cycle for at least that level of hockey. And I'll probably be just, watching it on TV because it's the only real thing you can probably do this week. And I don't get into NCAA basketball quite yet. And there's just nothing on until we get the UFL here in a couple weeks.
Yeah, so we'll talk about UFL on the show as well. We might do a rebrand. We might keep this same because I like the green here. Sean says, thinking in bets with Annie Duke. I got a fun Annie Duke story. When I teach my class at Wharton, Annie Duke is one of the guest speakers, and she always talks shit about Chris Collinsworth.
Love that.
And every single time she forgot, back when I was doing the teaching the class and working for Chris, she always forgot that he was my boss until I told her. And then, of course, 12 months would go by and she'd forget again. And she'd always find a way to make fun of Chris. But now Chris isn't our boss anymore. So I kind of let it slip now. But she always rips on Chris for the 2014 Super Bowl where he got mad at the Seahawks for not running Marshawn Lynch up the middle and instead throwing an interception. It's funny because we still have Russell Wilson in the league and he's still throwing interceptions, which is a blessing for all of us. Speaking of a blessing, Ben, this has been great. I had a great time. Let's do this again next Friday. Thank you for all the great work you do for us at Sumer. This is a great reprieve. I've enjoyed getting to create content today. So for Ben Brown, for Eric Eager, this has been the SumerSports Show.